Welcome to Indications and Warnings, everyone, with Chuck Pfarrer, co-produced by Alan Brewer. This is day 971 of Russia's full-scale genocidal invasion of Ukraine. Chuck and I are recording this show on October 22, 2024. Chuck, welcome to what will be our seventh broadcast now of Indications and Warnings for the Information Warfare Initiative on YouTube.
It's great to be here, Alan. We have taken our baby steps, and now we are at the stage where we can stagger around and hit our head on the coffee table.
Watch out, everyone who's watching. Pretty soon, we'll be standing pretty solidly with the help of that coffee table, right?
Exactly. So we're getting it going, and thank you everyone for staying with us, and thanks for tuning in.
Well, we are going to take a pretty detailed look at the situation in Ukraine right now. We're only going to take a look at one map on the zero line from Kupiansk, but I think the biggest development, it must be on everyone's mind. It's North Korea sending as many as 10,000 or 12,000 soldiers to assist Russia in Ukraine. We don't know where they'll be deployed. People have speculated maybe helping Russia in Kursk. We don't know. What do you think about this development, Chuck?
Well, it doesn't bode well. Right now, there are somewhere between 3,000, which I think is an extremely low estimate, and 10,000 North Korean troops in occupied Ukraine or in adjacent Russian territory. I think the number is probably closer to 10,000 than 3,000. In terms of North Korea entering combat, well, I think you'd have to say that they have. Their missileers have carried out dozens of ballistic missile attacks on Ukrainian cities. No one can persuade me otherwise, because these North Korean missile systems did not come with manuals translated into Russian. These came with North Korean crews and missileers. There are other reports, and some of them from normally substantive sources, that there may be as many as 100,000 North Korean troops being trained in the Russian Far East. I find that to be likely a credible report. Now, whether they're going to enter combat in Ukraine, 100,000 people is basically 3 divisions. That's a very considerable force of infantry. It remains to be seen. But these are the kind of indications and warnings that cannot be ignored. It is not beyond the realm of possibility that North Korea is going to enter combat in Ukraine, but we'll have to see.
Wouldn't that be enough evidence to change some minds in capitals around the world that Ukraine is fighting a world war on our behalf, and which I believe they have been doing for 971 days. Russia has always had the assistance of Iran, of China, and of North Korea. It's simply coming more into view. But with North Korean troops fighting shoulder to shoulder with Russians, and whatever role Russians assign them, that has all the look of a world war to me.
It certainly does. We saw earlier in the war, and at the beginning of the large-scale invasion here, Putin does not seem to grasp impending consequences. He doesn't seem to get them. And I'm always happy to remind people, I didn't think Russia would invade. I thought, if you're lining up a 20-mile-long convoy, you're not serious about invading. This is a bluff. This was so incredibly inept that it couldn't possibly be real. And putting on my hat and not Putin's hat, I also thought, if you invade with this magnitude of force, you're gonna force Finland into NATO, you're gonna force Sweden into NATO, various other eventualities which have happened, all of them highly negative to Russian geopolitics. He did it anyway. So looking forward to this eventuality, North Korean forces in large battalions, regiments, divisions entering combat into Ukraine, that would have immediate and highly negative consequences for Russia and for North Korea. That might give a prudent individual some pause, but we saw that none of those consequences had any effect on Putin. Look at just the loss of the Baltic, just the fact that now the Baltic is a NATO lake, that should have been enough to dissuade him from doing it, but it wasn't. So we'll see. Could he be willing to do this? Is this a possible plan? Well, nothing can be taken off the table with this guy. Nothing.
Well, Putin bluffs. There's no question about that. And he bluffs even while overplaying his hand. That's what an expert bluffer does. North Korea is sending not just common combat troops, but some pretty elite forces that are specially trained in North Korea. And also, it has been reported by Newsweek that North Korea may well send pilots. So it's a force multiplier for Russia that they have profiled probably and asked North Korea for this profile of forces. What can you send us?
Yeah, I did a thing last week for the Kyiv Post, and it was examining what is North Korea doing in Ukraine, what is it doing in Russia, and what's the relationship? What is the quid pro quo? You know, it was pretty damning that Russia needs 3 million artillery shells a year. It was interesting to me because it tells me they can't make 3 million shells a year. They need, and not only are they digging deep into the discount rack, you know, they're getting North Korean made product, and that has already, there's been problems, right? Some of their missiles veer off course, some of them don't launch, some of them break up in the air. Some of the artillery shells that North Korea has given Russia get stuck in artillery barrels and kill the gun crews. So that, you know, we can see Russia has material needs. What does North Korea want? Well, it wants better airplanes. It wants help with its aerospace. It has a space program, but that is the fig leaf to its coming to grips with truly intercontinental ballistic, nuclear-armed ballistic missiles. North Korea is getting continuing help with sub-launched ballistic missiles. Russia is building a ballistic missile submarine for North Korea. These are the things that North Korea is going to get out of this. North Korea has some extremely capable special operations forces. We know this because they've carried out operations against South Korea. They've carried out assassinations. They actually raided the Blue House, which is the presidential mansion in Seoul. They have got great capabilities. But North Korea has not been in a large-scale war or used large-scale maneuver warfare in the last 70 years. They have no combat experience. Now, they have sent military advisors to a lot of the hotspots in the world. In several places there were North Koreans on the other side. They are particularly good about teaching dictators how to inculcate a police state and inflict that on their populations. The big but is these forces don't have combat experience. You've seen the beribboned, big-hatted military thugs with all their things on them. None of those are battle awards. So will they be good? I don't know. But as Stalin says, quantity has a quality all its own. And there's going to be a lot of them.
Well, Putin's first unanticipated consequence of his invitation to North Korea to help him in the war against Ukraine, the first unanticipated consequence is South Korea's reaction, almost immediate, and an offer to Ukraine and its NATO allies to immediately send South Korean intelligence advisors so that they might be present when North Korean soldiers are captured. They'd be there to conduct interrogations, for example. But South Korea also has 3.5 million 105 millimeter artillery shells that they will consider delivering to Ukraine. A pretty impressive response by South Korea, if you ask me.
Yeah, absolutely. And the quality of the South Korean armed forces is top notch. Top notch. For example, South Korean fighter pilot compared to his North Korean analog, well, the North Korean pilot probably gets maybe 30 or 40 flight hours a year. They're flying antiquated aircraft. Their most advanced aircraft are like Gen 1 MiG-29s. North Korea is the only nation still flying MiG-15s, which are, again, older than you and I. So North Korea, its willingness to join in this war may be another big mistake, not only for Putin, but for North Korea itself. But we'll have to see. You know, the other thing is, I don't know that North Korea can count on, they've already had desertions. There are at least 19 people who have deserted and quite possibly defected, because we don't hear anymore about the search for them, and Ukraine isn't saying anything, and Russia isn't saying they caught them. So you also have to look at that, those 19 people defecting, they were among the first units to come. So you would presume they were the most politically reliable. They had the most skills. These were the vanguard of their forces. I don't know what's going to stop a lot of these North Korean soldiers from sniffing Europe and taking advantage of the main chance. That may happen. That's what psychological warfare is for, right? So there should be a new Korean language set of broadcasts and leaflets, et cetera, and see if we can exploit that seam.
Absolutely. It's easier to defect in Ukraine than it is to try and cross the border between North and South Korea. Although, you know, some North Korean defectors obviously have accomplished that. It's not an easy task by any means. Much easier to surrender and defect on the battlefield in Ukraine. Chuck, would it be appropriate for NATO forces in response to North Korean boots on the ground in Ukraine or in occupied Russia, appropriate for NATO forces to respond by putting NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine?
You know, it might be. And I would think that the first contact on the battle line where discernible North Korean units are participating in a battle, and I don't mean 15 or 20 guys, I don't mean simply artillerists supporting Russian maneuvers, but I mean actual North Korean bayonets. I could certainly see a modulated NATO response, which would be NATO trainers deployed in larger units to Ukraine to train Ukrainian forces and quite possibly advise them, which is, training is different than advising. I think the other notable consequence of that would be, and I would hope, there would be an opening of the floodgates as far as equipment to Ukraine. I think that might be one of the, there are things that strongly militate against allowing North Korea into this battle space. But again, Putin doesn't foresee consequence very well. And in his pointed little mind, he thinks, look, I get away with all kinds of things and they don't do anything. I nerve gas people in UK and they don't do anything. I assassinate people in broad daylight in Germany and they don't do anything. Blah, 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 blah. But, he may be about to jump the shark. And I think, you're right, Alan. If NATO needs more prodding and they need more reasons to enter this conflict or step farther. And I think Putin is going to provide them with those, with those stimuli.
Well, it so happens that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was in Kyiv when first reports of North Korea's participation in this war came out. He arrived by train for an unannounced visit to Kyiv. It was interesting. He provided the second, in 2 weeks' time, the second military assistance package, another $400 million military package for Ukraine. It's part of the Presidential Drawdown Authority. If the United States keeps up with this weekly delivery of military aid packages, it would reduce that Presidential Drawdown Authority to zero by just about the time a new president takes the oath of office, which I think is perfect timing for Biden to use the remaining days of his presidency and the remaining funds in his Presidential Drawdown Authority.
Yeah, and anytime there are disbursements to Ukraine, that is great. Unfortunately, they always come almost too late. They're all nick of time. And, when someone compares 400 million to $1 billion, I mean, it is a pittance. Like $400 million is a fortune. Absolutely. It's amazing. But there are series of movies that cost more than $400 million. Yeah. It's not a lot of money when you're fighting a war for national survival. Nevertheless, I encourage Secretary Austin, a man I greatly admire, let's get on the ball here. And, Secretary Austin, unlike a lot of secretaries of defense, look, he was a four-star general. He knows what it takes to fight this war. He knows what it takes to win this war. But with his civilian SecDef hat on, he has to, he executes policy of the commander-in-chief. Ukraine needs everything. There isn't anything that they don't need. So the sooner, the better.
The United States is also investing in Ukraine's domestic defense industry, contributing an $800 million loan. And I think this is actually part of appropriations from last year. Finally, a decision being made, the United States will inject this $800 million into the Ukrainian defense industry, which, by the way, is taking off, as you would expect it would in the course of this war. Hidden manufacturing spots, dispersed factories, all working 24 hours a day, delivering not only millions of drones, but homemade howitzers, towed artillery, artillery shells, and God only knows what innovations on behalf of Ukraine.
Yeah, Ukraine is going forward, from now on until Judgment Day, Ukraine is going to need an indigenous defense industry producing airplanes, unmanned aerial vehicles, artillery, ballistic missiles, drones, sensors, radars, surface to air missiles, everything that it takes to live in that bad neighborhood. That is simply what's going to have to happen. And that brings us to focus a little bit on what is the strategic goal of this conflict, right? For Russia, it is the subjugation, domination, and occupation of Ukraine. That's what they're fighting for, to return it to its status as a vassal state of Russia. Okay, what is Ukraine fighting for? Well, they're fighting for national freedom, to conduct their own internal politics and their own foreign policy. And the aim of this war for Ukraine, in my estimation, is to destroy the Russian army, not merely frustrate Russia, not necessarily even defeat Russia in Ukraine, but to make sure that Russia doesn't have the implement, the tool, the club, the knife to do this to Ukraine ever again. Or you want them to remember this war in Russia for a generation, that this was not worth the effort. That's what has to be. Because as we've seen in Chechnya, Georgia, South Ossetia, Russia will negotiate a armistice, peace treaty, fill in the blank that doesn't mean anything, and they'll come back a year later. Ask the Chechens. That's exactly what they did to them, and ask the Georgians. That's what they did to them as well.
And Ukraine knows that history, and they don't want to take that chance. You know, I saw just yesterday or today, Henry Kissinger in 1992 testifying before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And remember, this is a year after Ukraine had become an independent nation, a year after the Soviet Union had collapsed. In 1992, Kissinger was saying he knew of no Russian leader who thought the collapse of the Soviet Union was anything but a temporary phenomenon. And that this is 32 years ago now, their intention then was to reconstruct the Soviet empire, if necessary, piece by piece by piece. I think Kissinger even said, he named a few nations and then said, or whatever they're called, which is an odd thing for that man to say. But he knew 32 years ago, this is Russia's plan.
Well, and you look at Putin, you look at his pedigree, you look at his education, you look at his previous profession. He is the last Homo Sovieticus. He is the last Soviet man, and his worldview and his geopolitics are that the Soviet Union still exists. They have the Commonwealth of Independent States. I read that as satellite vassal nations. And they all have, let's call them party apparatchiks, just like in the old days. These are a string of corrupt dictators in these associated nations. And, let's call it like it was. Ukraine was the jewel of the Soviet socialistic republics. It was the brains of the Soviet Union. It had agriculture. It had a vast class of intellectuals, aerospace, shipbuilding, missile technology. All of this came from Ukraine. Even in Stalin's time, Stalin felt it was necessary to subjugate Ukraine, to wipe out its language and culture, and as we both know, liquidate its intellectual classes. Putin's goal is every bit as vile as Stalin's was. I like people just to imagine, this war goes on, you people get tired of it. I'm tired of hearing about it. I want you to imagine for 1 second what the nation of Ukraine would look like if it were defeated and occupied by the troops that gave you Bucha, Izium, Mariupol. Try to imagine the horror, the famine, the genocide. This is not this is not an existential war for Russia, but it is an existential war for Ukraine. And we can't stand by and watch the Holodomor happen again.
And this is why I think viewers need to understand that a peace plan based on the exchange of land for peace or an armistice will never be acceptable to Ukraine, because it's not land you're giving up. It's hundreds of thousands of individual Ukrainian lives you are putting at risk, and they are put at risk. They are put at risk of torture. They are put at risk of execution and imprisonment, but they're also just thrown into the Russian brainwashing machine. All those Russian schools that have been set up for Ukrainian kids, whether inside occupied Ukraine or at the camps back inside Russia, their one aim is to turn that Ukrainian young person literally against themselves, against their culture, against their family, against their language, against their home. And it can be accomplished. The Russians have demonstrated that.
They have. And it's, and it isn't just the people at stake. But one of the reasons Russia came across and concentrated in the East were the natural resources that are there. There are coal mines, there are salt mines, there are lithium mines, there is energy, there is oil, there are all sorts of natural resources there, which Putin dispersed to his kennel of oligarchs so they can gobble these things up. Ukraine will not have a future, not just a prosperous future. It won't have any kind of future as long as Russia controls Crimea. It will put a boot across the throat of Ukraine's chances for world commerce, right? It will negatively inflect freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, which is the primary means by which Ukraine's greatest exports, agriculture, it feeds the world. You give Putin that unsinkable aircraft carrier in Crimea, and we are back to stage one. And that's ignoring for a second the utterly unlawful appropriation of Crimea. You can't build a bridge to somebody else's country and then say, hey, it's mine now. And that's exactly what he did.
Yeah, that is exactly what he did. Russia's agricultural output is falling. Their agricultural exports will reach their lowest point since 2020, 2021. This is one of the reasons, of course, why they are stealing so much Ukrainian grain and exporting it from Mariupol, for example. But it's also a good reason for us to recall how important it was for Ukraine to preserve Odessa and Mykolaiv at the beginning of the war. Had Russia been able to reach Odessa and Mykolaiv, two goals that they had, they would have controlled the entire Ukrainian Black Sea coast. It was a significant achievement for the Ukrainians to stop the Russians short there. And it enabled Ukraine to resume agricultural export, to actually create this safe navigational corridor across the Black Sea. It was a huge victory for Ukraine early in the war.
Yeah, absolutely. Probably the most significant ground operation they've had. Odessa, of course, literally back to the Viking times, is a thriving seaport, and then Mykolaiv, which is up the Bug River from the Donetsk estuary. Mykolaiv is also a major shipbuilding, and not only a port, but a major shipbuilding location where, in fact, the Moskva was built in Mykolaiv. So, vitally important that that happened. And and remember, that was a very nearly run thing. I mean, the Russians got to the outskirts of Mykolaiv, and then for a year and a half or so, they held on to Kherson. So it was it's also worth remembering how quickly those Russian forces collapsed in the Kharkiv offensive and in the Kherson offensive. And things look a little bleak right now. I'm the first to admit it. Just don't forget those two events, because the strains that created that brittleness in the Russian forces, not only are they still there, but they are magnifying. They are twisting and turning the body politic and morale of Russian armed forces. They're not getting any happier. They're not getting better fed. They're not being better led. They're not being better commanded. Those forces are torquing that army. We'll see again another offensive, and we're going to see the Russian army do just what it did, falling back by increments of 10 and 20 kilometers at a time. That's ahead. We'll just have to wait and see when it happens.
Summer 2025, or maybe late summer, early fall 2025. And it's the late summer autumnal sun coming through my window, Chuck, that is causing havoc with my lighting here. I'm going to have to find a new place. I pulled the shade. I guess I need to get a blackout curtain.
Well, I look like I'm in a glass of iced tea. I don't know why. I've got the windows open here, but anyway.
Well, speaking of Kherson, it's in Kherson where first reports came out of Russians using FPV drones to hunt down individual Ukrainians just going about their day's business on the streets of Kherson, going to market, driving home from market, out on a bike. The Russians, rather than looking for and targeting Ukrainian military positions around Kherson, choose instead to turn Kherson streets into a shooting gallery, track down individual Ukrainian citizens with FPV drones and grenades. Really, the Russians can't actually find military positions to attack, and instead they do this kind of sport in the streets of Kherson.
It is always a war crime to shoot a non-combatant. Always, 100% of the time. If a civilian is hit with a bullet, there's always some excuse. You could say, look, that was a ricochet. I wasn't aiming at that person. I had no idea that wasn't an aimed shot, etc. But when you've got literal video of an FPV stalking and killing a person in an ambulance window, a woman pushing a shopping cart, I mean, that shows you the depravity of the Russian combatants. That's okay with them. They were likely ordered to do that. And as we've seen, I mean, Kherson is a shooting gallery. I mean, you and I have reported on this. They hit a maternity hospital. They hit a cancer ward. They hit a pediatric hospital. I quit counting the number of medical facilities that they deliberately aimed at. It isn't surprising. I mean, it's disgusting, but it isn't surprising that they would resort to this. And I'd suggest, look, they probably like to find a military target, but Ukraine is great at dispersing, at camouflaging, and not presenting lucrative targets to the Russians, who, out of frustration, I don't want to say that because it isn't frustration. This is what they think is going to break the will of the Ukrainian people. Literally hunting down grandmothers with FPV drones. I don't know who is listening to us today, but you make your own moral judgment on that and then scale it up to their entire war effort. This is what they are about.
We should give credit to this young Irish reporter, Kaylin Robertson, who traveled to Kherson and made a short movie. And I would recommend to people to watch it. I think it's called Hunted in Kherson, not sure. But I give that young reporter a lot of credit for going to the sound of the guns, basically. And give it a watch. I don't want to suppress our audience, Chuck, and we do speak with folks on the ground every day in Ukraine, but neither you nor I are on the ground in Ukraine. And
no, we're not.
Here's your chance to hear from someone on the ground. So go and see what you think.
Absolutely. That is what this war is about in a nutshell. Kherson has, of course, been in Ukrainian hands for the better part of 2 years now. And it is a daily target for Russian artillerists. They just chew up the rubble. It shows what they're all about. And Kherson might get a lion's share of the media coverage, but in fact, every crossroads, every hamlet, every little town, and even some big towns that are within the range of Russian artillery, they are shelled every single day. Places of no military utility. Places, in fact, that are so ludicrously small. A little hamlet called Rivnopil near Velika Novosilka. It's at the end of a one-way dirt road. There's nothing there. If you go there, you can't go anywhere else. It's likely what was remained of a one-family farm, but they have utterly destroyed it. They've hit it with thousands of artillery shells. To what end? Ruski Mir. Here, have a taste of the Russian world. That's their purpose. That's their aim.
Well, it was just overnight in Sumy that the Russians destroyed a kindergarten. There were not children there, but again, what is the point of Russia attacking civilian infrastructure of all kinds, not just power, gas, water, the utility infrastructure, but the cultural and community infrastructure of Ukrainian towns, villages, and the cities, the markets, the schools, the hospitals, you name it. Thousands and thousands of these places have been destroyed by Russian glide bombs and drone attacks and ballistic missiles as well. In Sumy, they aimed glide bombs again at a residential center of the city, killing 3 people and injuring a dozen more. Such numbers are repeated all across Ukraine because there is no city in Ukraine that's not a frontline city when you come right down to it. Zaporizhia has come in recently for attacks by glide bombs. Kharkiv is shelled and attacked by glide bombs every day. And of course, we have seen what's going on in Kherson. It is Russian terror adding up by, yes, a few numbers every single day, but it's every single day. This has been the deadliest summer of the war for Ukrainian civilians. But it's a feature of this past summer that has gone unnoticed.
Yeah, they're more than 90%, and in the high 90s, and everyone has heard me say this a million times, but it bears saying 1,000,001 time. If a Russian pilot, artillerist, missileer pushes the button on a precision strike munition, better than 90% of the time, it is aimed at a civilian target. They launch 100 ballistic missiles, 95% of them are designed to hit civilians. That's their prime target. The Mariupol Drama Theater was filled with 800 refugees. They painted the word children in the parking lot in 10-foot letters. A Russian pilot lasered it up and dropped a laser-guided bomb and killed 600 people just for shits and giggles. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of more examples, not of that magnitude of casualties, but maybe tens of thousands more examples of apartment buildings being hit, hospitals being hit, and none of this stuff is collateral damage. Those were the prime targets. They continue to be prime targets of Russia. So just lean a little bit forward. What do you think Ukraine would look like if it lost this war? What mercy could it expect from these people? None. None. And it seems sometimes that the American national security establishment, not talking about you, Jake Sullivan, they seem to worry if Russia is defeated, it may come apart. Well, Russia already came apart, right? The Soviet Union already came apart. In terms of its relations vis-a-vis with the West, look, I lived through most of the Cold War. You know, I was born during the Cold War, and I was in the service when the Cold War ostensibly ended. Things are worse now than they ever were, with the maybe the exception of the Cuban Missile Crisis. But in terms of kinetic conflict, it's worse. I mean, don't forget some of the little things that didn't lift the headlines. A Russian fighter jet fired an air-to-air missile at a NATO reconnaissance plane in the Black Sea. That's already happened. That happened. The Brits played it down, but the truth came out. He missed. You know, remember who we're in this with. You know, Putin isn't in this for kumbaya, right? This is an imperial war of aggression on what had to be a perennial target for Imperial Russia, Soviet Russia, and now Putin's Russia. They want Ukraine.
And it is Putin writing his imagined greatness into history with a victory in Ukraine. And he wants to leave a legacy after he's dead and gone, which could be sooner rather than later. But he wants to leave a legacy that would be unparalleled in Russian history. This is the kind of, I'd have to kind of call it it's not a mindset. It's not a wish. It's a kind of, I mean, you're the psychologist, Chuck. It's a kind of psychosis, isn't it?
It's certainly messianic and megalomaniacal. I never compared myself to Peter the Great, but he does. He actually thinks that way. It isn't, there isn't a national politic. It is a big mafia family, with Putin tossing around industries, national resources to his oligarchs, and they surround him and feed off him. And we have only to look at history. Now, I don't think Putin is going to fall anytime in the imminent future. But regimes like his, they all share something in common. They look completely stable until they're not. You can ask Nicolae Ceausescu how that works. Everything went apart for him in the space of about 20 minutes. 24 hours later, he was found guilty in a revolutionary court and shot. Colonel Gaddafi put on his headdress and went out that morning, and he thought everything was going to be great. And 4 hours later, they were pulling him out of a road culvert and shooting him. But we know from history, not even Nero, not even Caligula, right? They were in charge until it ended in a second. And it ends when the Praetorian Guard, when the people around you, when they fear for their lives or their livelihoods, they'll move. And put yourself in Putin's shoes. Look, he already survived a serious threat, right? The Przemyśl mutiny. Putin doesn't forget every morning brushing his teeth. That guy headed for Moscow and nobody stopped him. Nobody stopped him. The Air Force tried and he shot down 4 helicopters and a command and control plane. Not one Russian soldier said, "Can I see your papers, please?" They all waved him through. So that'll come to, there's a future footnote for you. Let's just save that footnote because we're going to use it later.
And we will. Maybe we'll get Doug London back on that day to help us.
Absolutely. Doug is a great guy. We'll get Doug in here.
The front line is alive with action. We're going to take a look at one map from Kupiansk, and later this week we'll have some more maps to look at. But just in the past couple of days, Russia suffered its most lethal day in the course of the war, more than 1,700 killed and wounded. The very next day, more than 1,300 killed and wounded. Large numbers of armored vehicles destroyed. This is the result of Russia picking up its tempo of attacks all along the front line. But what do they aim to gain from this increased tempo?
Well, that's interesting in itself. So let's draw a corollary from that. The harder Russia fights, the more people it loses. So you would think with an expenditure of resources, the harder I fight, the more land I gain, right? Or the harder I fight, the more of the enemy I kill. But in this case, the harder I fight, the more of my own guys I kill. So, and I'm sure I don't have to remind everybody with the math, but being a psychology major, if you're losing 1,000 guys a day, right, you're on par to kill 360,000 of your own troops in a year. Okay. Is that good? Is that bad? 400,000 people became casualties in the American Civil War. Over 4 years, counting casualties on both sides. So if you're going to lose a similar number of people in 1 year of combat, you can see that at least one of your resources is not being expended to any purpose, and that is manpower. Russia is also in this situation that it is, whenever it puts together an operation, and we'll talk, this will segue into what's going on in Kupiansk, where they put together recently an operation that was different than most of them because it was about a battalion-sized effort. They generally don't operate in battalion-sized chunks. They lost 900 people in 20 minutes. because they attacked in two columns, bumper to bumper. They maneuvered their forces so a swamp was between them. But if you can kill 900 of your adversary in 20 minutes, I would suggest to our Russian listening guests, you're probably doing something wrong. I mean, that's a lot of people to get killed on a coffee break. That's a lot. And they don't show the propensity for getting smarter, fighting smarter. Their leadership has gone down. And when you're killing people, your own people at that rate, and they cannot be replaced with combatants, right? The average time of a Russian citizen who gets brought into the military, within 3 weeks, and sometimes a matter of days, he's on the zero line. And if you're a civilian listening to this, try to imagine that. I'm going to say, come with me, and I'm going to drag you into my SEAL platoon. And you've been in the military, let's say 2 weeks. How do you think you do on your first mission? I don't think you do too well.
No.
I don't think I'd take you with me because you're just going to get hurt. But that is not what Russian officers think.
Well, I'd want you to take me with you, Chuck, because that's the only way I'd be safe.
I'm losing up. I've used up all my luck, though, Alan. I'm not going to get back in the show. But anyway,
one thing at this state of the war, we all see these videos of Russian armored assaults, and what happens? They're in line on a road. Either the lead vehicle or a vehicle close to the front of the column is hit by a Ukrainian weapon, or it drives over a mine. And then the tanks and armored personnel carriers behind it disperse out across the field, hitting additional mines. Do the Russians not know where the mines are? Are these minefields that the Ukrainians have secretly laid overnight, only to invite the Russians once again to attack in this armored column and pay the consequences? What's happening here, Chuck?
It's a little of everything. The easiest thing to do, one of the easiest military evolutions, is to conduct a frontal attack, right? You get your guys in line, hopefully not in column, but in echelon, and you go forward and attack the enemy. That's the easiest thing to do. And it's easier in broad daylight than it is in darkness, where everything isn't just twice as hard, it's actually about 5 times as hard. But, and here's the but, the Russians have shown they're incapable of conducting any evolutions at night. They can't do it. If you've got guys with 2 weeks training, you can't do it. The other thing about operating at night is the more you do it, the better you get at it. But with the training pipeline measured in weeks, not months, for example, it takes 6 to 8 months for the U.S. Army to train an infantryman who enters his profession as a journeyman, right? He just has the modicum of, he doesn't know all the tricks of an old soldier. He just has the basics. You want to be a ranger? Now we're talking about a year. You want to be a Green Beret? That's 2 years of training. You want to be a SEAL? Same thing, 2 years, maybe 2.5 years of training. So these Russian officers have these untrained troops, but there's no excuse for that level of incompetence in the military leadership. These attacks in Kupiansk that came to grief, south of Kupiansk, attempting to reach the Oskil River, a 2-pronged attack, about 60 vehicles, 40 in the north, 20 in the south. The forces were consolidated in broad daylight. They were put into a column, dragging behind them a 2-mile-long dust cloud in broad daylight, heading, in each case, down a road that led to only one location. And surprise of surprises, the area was heavily mined. The FPV drones came in, the artillery came in, And interestingly enough, although I try not to watch these kinds of films, when the attack was being beaten down, every single Russian soldier dismounted from their vehicles and ran east the way they came. Nobody stood up and said, "Follow me." Nobody said, "They're over there." Everybody ran away. And 900 of them perished. That bodes well for Ukraine in this war, especially when we look at, this would be a regular sized attack. Let's say a battalion sized attack. Might have been a credible force to reach that objective, maybe, but they split the force in half. Not good. They weren't converging. No, they actually had a terrain feature between them. This was utterly inept. It was badly planned, badly executed, and frankly, it couldn't have been more egregiously defeated. So they started out with 1,000, they lost 900, and it was over in 20 minutes. Okay, that's like the little bighorn, right?
Yeah.
That wasn't good.
That is like the little bighorn. So I'm looking at the map from Kupiansk, Chuck. The terrain in Kupiansk complicates almost everything that the Russians will attempt to do. If you trace your finger along the P79 or the H26 as it runs south to north, you can see the topography favors Ukrainian defense to the west of the river course that runs through the city because there's high ground there. I mean, I look at this map and think the Russians are going to get slaughtered as they should somewhere on the east side of Kupiansk.
Yeah, and if folks, if you're looking at the map there, you can see Kupiansk is a city with two sections. The eastern section on the eastern bank of the Oskil River, it has trees and broken terrain to the east, and those bands of trees are vitally important. They are exceptionally good defensive terrain. And you go across the Oskil River and you see a series of bluffs and high ground there. It brings to mind, it's not exactly analogous, but it brings to mind the relationship of Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar. Both with Bakhmut, the easier terrain was to the east, and Chasiv Yar with the more complex terrain to the west. I don't know. There is constant Russian pressure against Kupiansk, and mass is a really difficult thing to overcome. When you are outnumbered by your enemy and they are continually pouring forces into the battle equation, that's kind of hard to beat. But it isn't company-sized action that's going to take Kupiansk, right? It's going to take brigade task groups. And a brigade is a number of battalions. Okay. We have very seldom seen Russia fighting at the brigade level. And what we did see in Kupiansk here recently was a battalion-sized effort by Russia, which again stands out because they don't very often operate at a sufficient volume, which a battalion force would be, but seldom. Let's call it like we see it. There aren't a lot of battalions who got wiped out in 20 minutes. I have a really hard time finding those unless it's back in sort of the Napoleonic age or in the American Civil War when they slugged it out with muskets at 50 yards. Losing a battalion in 20 minutes on a modern battlefield is almost something somebody should get a medal for. Yeah. And that does bode well for Kupiansk.
Well, sad to say, because it will be so difficult for the Russians to advance toward Kupiansk or beyond it, it makes Kupiansk the next target for destruction, just as Bakhmut was destroyed, just as the Russians are destroying Chasiv Yar now, because the west side of Kupiansk is something of a fortress. So Russian advances will be foiled when that happens. They will destroy what they cannot occupy. And then when the day comes for them to occupy that city, it's rubble. Just like Vovchansk is rubble. I mean, there's nothing that the Russians seem to care about in terms of completely destroying Ukrainian cities, and some villages will probably never ever come back to life again at the end of this war.
You know, there is a inflection that would normally happen in any war, but it doesn't happen in this war. So, for example, if I were the battalion commander who got annihilated in 90 minutes in a NATO army, I'd be relieved of command. Right? I'd be taken off the line, and in this case, likely dereliction of duty, all kinds of other charges would be heaped on me. In the case of the Russians, this guy's probably going to get a medal, right? He's going to be left in command and probably given greater responsibilities. And this sounds like a little bit of a joke, but it isn't. These are the kind of people who will rise through the command, the chain of command in the Russian army. So it is literally incompetence getting you promoted. And although we are in this time of consequence right now, where it appears Russian forces are in the ascendant, I don't see their gains as being proportional to their losses. You're losing 1,500 people a day. There was no time during the Vietnam War where 1,500 American troops were killed during the day. There was no time in the Afghan War. You know, there were very few times in the Korean War where that happened, but it's a daily occurrence here in this war. So almost 400,000 Russians have become casualties already, and that's in 900 days of war. But for this year, Russia is on par to lose 360,000 people a year, so that at the end of this year, they would have lost 700,000 troops. That gives us pause, and it should, but unfortunately, it won't give Putin pause.
Well, 1 million casualties, killed and wounded on the Russian side of this war, is a milestone not far off in the future, Chuck. I mean, it could potentially be reached around or just after the February 2025 anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion. It could be reached by then.
And as you said, I mean, this week there was a 1,700 casualty day.
Yeah. I mean, it just, I don't know. I mean, look, I know that there are Ukrainian casualties every single day as well, killed and wounded. We don't know the numbers. It's been variously reported, but nothing even close to the deaths and injuries that Ukraine inflicts on Russian forces every single day. Nothing close to it. But look, if Ukraine suffered such a daily loss, they wouldn't be able to keep fighting. You know, they're only 40 million odd people in Ukraine, fewer today than when the war began. So we do know that Ukrainian commanders from the top to the zero line are protecting their men and women, trying to preserve their lives while accomplishing this mission of self-defense. And I think they are doing a pretty good job.
They are. And, it's a crime what's being done to Ukraine. Look, they did nothing to provoke this war. They did not invade Russia. They've done nothing to provoke Russia except throw off the Russian appointed and anointed dictators that were foisted upon them, right? With the fig leaf of fiddled elections. So it's really unfortunate. And I think it's the United States that leads the misapprehensions here. Ukraine is fighting Europe's war, and it's fighting America's war. Look, there is no bright, shining future with Russia as a partner in the community of nations. It just isn't going to happen. It isn't. And should Ukraine fall, it won't be the last morsel that this voracious creature wants to gobble up. No one can kid themselves about that, right? Next, it's the Baltic states. It's Estonia. It's Lithuania. Then it's Moldova. Then it's Romania. Then it'll be Poland. And if there's one good thing about North Korean troops coming in here, and if the indications are true that some number between 50 and 100,000 North Korean troops are being trained in the East, it's finally one of those facts that's going to be laid in front of NATO. You're going to have to make a decision now. It's Russia that has internationalized this war. North Korean troops have already pulled triggers in this war. They have launched scores of ballistic missiles at Ukrainian cities. They're already combatants. Folks, don't kid yourself. There are Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps members in Ukraine right now. They operate the Shahed apparatus. They train Russian troops. They distribute these weapons. They're on the ground and they are combatants as well. Russia has internationalized this conflict. Let's do what's good for everyone. Ukraine isn't asking for our sons and daughters. They don't want the Marine Corps. They don't want the 82nd Airborne. All they want is the tools. Just give us the tools. And you look at what they've done. We have given Ukraine nothing, no weapon that could possibly hit a target outside Moscow. Ukraine made that themselves in a garage, right? With a couple of aeronautical engineers. They put together those deep strike weapons. They're fighting an asymmetrical conflict. They are battling it out with one of the last superpower dictatorships, maybe the last one on earth. But we've got to help them. We've got to do it.
We do have to help them. And I think later this week, Chuck and I will take a much closer look at the military aid packages that have been announced in consecutive weeks now by the United States. And I think that we'll also take a look at the Ukrainian defense industry. Ukraine has developed its own long-range ballistic missiles, 2 models to date. They have been tested. One is able to be manufactured. One cannot be manufactured currently because Ukraine doesn't have access to all the components it needs. So maybe that is a deficiency the United States can step in and correct, rather than Western components showing up in drones and ballistic missiles hitting targets in Ukraine, needed Western components will be delivered to Ukraine and put into their domestic defense manufacturing. So we do have later this week, Chuck, a lot of ground to cover on the 600-mile zero line from Kherson to Kursk, and we will look again at Kursk, and we'll look wherever the zero line it gives us a hot spot to examine.
Well, we're not going to run out of reporting.
No, we will not run out of reporting. So keep up with us on the Information Warfare Initiative. Subscribe, get notified when there's a new episode of Indications and Warnings that's posted to YouTube. We will be back this week, but for day 971 of Russia's full-scale genocidal invasion of Ukraine, that concludes our report today, Chuck. Slava Ukraini.
Herojam Slava. And thanks everyone for tuning in. And as Alan said, and I never thought I'd say this in my life, like us, give us a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm, and share the report if you'd like. But we're going to be here, and the IWI is growing. Soon there'll be upwards of 20 other reporting shows on here, and this will be a place for you to enrich your own information warfare environment and help you win some arguments at the Thanksgiving dinner table, which I know is coming up.